Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Andy Ricketts.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be talking about social enterprise opportunities for the voluntary sector and hearing how one charity pivoted to social enterprise to save itself from an unsustainable funding situation.
The charity in question is the National Migraine Centre, and we're joined by the charity's chief executive, Dan Tickle. Hello, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Andy.
And also with us in the studio is Peter Holbrook, the chief executive of Social Enterprise UK, which, as the name might suggest, is the UK's national body for social enterprise. Hello, Peter.
Good to be here, Lucinda.
So, Dan, if we could start with you, please tell us about the precarious situation that led to the National Migraine Centre pursuing social enterprise.
When I arrived, which was incredibly 4 years ago now, we were in a sorry state. We'd been operating from a physical clinic in London. We'd been battered first by COVID, which forced us to, as with many charities, completely rethink the way we delivered our services. And then, of course, by the challenging economic environment that followed. And all that, of course, was against a backdrop of falling voluntary income. Again, I think that's common for many charities. We don't see any income from government or the NHS, so we were very exposed to trends in falling voluntary income. In my first year after arriving, it was a rather scary first year, we made a thumping loss. The reserves were exhausted. We had income falling fast. I think we knew we had maybe 12 months to turn the ship around, or really that was it for us. So I think that really stark challenged, it focused minds. I could see that the model had to change, ramping up income from trusts or community fundraising, whatever. It just wasn't going to be enough. There was an issue with the viability of our model for the charity. We'd survived for years, just about getting by. But the COVID crisis and what followed really exposed the weaknesses in our model. So that's what led me to look seriously at a social enterprise solution. I think it's the urgency and the seriousness of the situation that meant I think the charity was really open to looking at ambitious solutions that could turn things around for us. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Our deficit became a substantial surplus within the first year. We've sustained it every year since. Our income has more than doubled in that time. But most importantly, we've been able to grow the number of doctors from 3 to 22. And so in each of those 3 years, we've treated more patients than ever before. And that's really what this is about for us, securing our future, making sure we're there for the next generation who need us, really growing our impact.
And can you talk about the practicalities, Dan, of that change? How did it come about that you considered a social enterprise model? And then what did you have to do in order to implement it at the charity?
So after the impact of COVID, pretty much everything we did moved online. That meant we could reach more patients, which is great. We could improve access. We could recruit more headache specialists. And crucially, there's really good evidence that patient outcomes are just as good online. So that's what had changed. But what hadn't changed is the funding model. Previously, patients would make their booking online and then they'd be invited to make a donation afterwards. And without those donations more or less equaling our costs per appointment, we were facing a deficit and eventually, of course, closure. And by the time we made that change to a social enterprise model, closure was a real possibility. I think the thing that changed for us, crucially, was culture. We really hadn't valued the service we were offering properly. People were visiting us, a charity, and they were seeing a trained headache specialist, one of the best in the country, for free. And then they were heading off to Harley Street, where they would spend several £100s on an appointment with a private neurologist who wasn't even a headache specialist often. And that just seemed unfair. We were offering an extraordinary service. We were a charity. We were turning people's lives around, and yet we were undervaluing it. So what we did instead, as I say, was more about a cultural shift for us. We set about moving from a tired, perhaps exhausted, declining charity that was dependent on the largesse of others to having the hunger and ambition of a startup. And I think that's the key. It was thinking of ourselves in that way. Now, in terms of practicalities, my own background, luckily, is in marketing and comms. So with our website and design agency, Door22, I rewrote the website from the ground up. We began to invest in marketing ourselves properly too, with a new brand, a digital marketing strategy, and a really confident belief in the value of our work. And although I don't suppose it was an obstacle as such. Certainly one of the challenges in turning the ship around while you continue to deliver services and funds are tight is capacity. So having to do much of the work yourself while overseeing the day-to-day operation was a really huge undertaking. We began essentially operating in competition with the private sector. We were offering private fixed fee appointments alongside continuing the ongoing routine appointments free to access. If you're coming to see us, the benefit of a private appointment is that all things being equal, you might be seen sooner, although we do have a triage system so we can prioritise clinical need regardless of appointment type. Now, I'd assumed that we might need to means test our services, but that absolutely hasn't been necessary. Just by marketing our services properly, changing our culture, behaving in an enterprising way, that's changed everything for us. You know, the day the new website went live, we moved from maybe 1 or 2 people requesting private appointments each week to the majority of our patients making that request. So those that can afford to are happy to pay for a quality service if we're prepared to believe in it and value it properly. And that's allowed us to massively expand capacity in a sustainable way for those people who can't afford private care. So it's allowed us to recruit many more doctors. It's guaranteeing our future. And we've done all that by maintaining an absolute commitment to the very highest standards of care and free access for every single person who needs it, regardless of their ability to pay.
So were there any initial concerns? It sounds like you've overcome them by what you've just said, but were there initial concerns, for example, at your board level about how you maintained your charitable ethos and any ethical considerations allowing better off people to perhaps jump the queue for services that you previously offered for free?
I am very lucky with the board because although not all of them were familiar with the concept of social enterprise, we had a really good mix of skills from across the private, the public and the voluntary sector. And I think they could see that without a very significant change to our model, we wouldn't survive, because a charity that's wedded solely to the concept of voluntary income is no use to anyone if it fails. And I was able to demonstrate a really clear costed plan that showed financial expansion, but crucially a huge growth in our income. And the financial projections for continuing as we were so bleak that I think the board was open to, in fact, looking for really bold suggestions. What was maybe unusual about the model the charity had up to that point as well was that the beneficiaries, that is our patients, were also our donor base. So we were inviting voluntary donations after appointments. And that I think has its own issues in terms of barriers to access. Ethically, I think we have a situation that I'm very happy with where those who can afford to pay for services now do so. And it's that work which allows us not only to continue, but to expand our work with those in greater clinical and financial need. And that seems to be, to me, a much better model.
Thank you. And Peter, you at Social Enterprise UK must have the bigger picture in terms of seeing other charities thinking about and then perhaps deciding to pursue social enterprise in the face of really dire economic problems that many of them are facing. Are you seeing trends like the National Migraine Centre of charities sort of turning to social enterprise more and more?
We have absolutely seen an increase. If you look at all of the trends from the NCVO Almanac and others, we are seeing a greater proportion of income coming from trading activity than ever before. And I recognise that and kind of embrace it. I also anecdotally have an awful lot of chief execs of charities coming to me in the final 6 months of that charity's life in desperation looking for a way out. But at that point, it's often too late. What Dan has done is to spot the problem from a distance, spot it on the horizon and to plan and prepare and adapt before it becomes too urgent to resolve. But yes, we see more and more charities earning their money. We see a lot of charities in crisis. I think, we all know that. And yet we are also seeing the continued growth of social enterprise. And I do think that organisations like Dan's, but many that have gone before Dan have also opted for this model. Organisations like London Early Years Foundation, which runs 42 children's nurseries, was established in 1908, but have adopted a social enterprise model for the last 20 years. P3, based in the Midlands, a wonderful organisation doing incredible work, proudly a charity and a social enterprise, and that's what's driven their kind of growth over the years. And there's many, many, many historic charities that have adopted social enterprise models over decades, not always just because they're in crisis, because I think social enterprise does offer something beyond just crisis resolution or a new source of income. It is a different mindset, as Dan has said. It's a kind of a cultural shift. And hopefully it enables organisations to fulfil their truest and best potential.
You were nodding very vociferously, if that's the right word for a nod. It probably isn't. But when Dan was talking about that mindset shift, could you talk a little bit about that yourself in terms of what that means for charities and indeed what charities are best suited to considering this kind of a shift?
Well, I think like any charity or any organisation or any leadership team really should look at the future and try and understand what it represents and to try and adapt and evolve. And I think that the kind of macro trends that we've been seeing is that kind of social enterprise gives organisations the ability to plan. It's much easier to forecast and understand what your trends are within a business than trying to predict the likelihood of getting grants in 2-3 years' time, because the grant landscape, it just changes so frequently. Priorities continue to shift. If you've got a product that people want and people are buying, your business model is much more resilient as a consequence. And so I think that there are some really important lessons to be learned. And in terms of culture, it is actually not just about structure, and people tend to obsess on structure rather than culture. And actually it's about leadership. It's about board capability, skills, understanding what the role of boards and governance structures are, and understanding risk, actually. Often the greatest risk is not adapting to the changing world that we are in, and being willing to innovate, to take risks, to recognise that if you stand still, you're going to always lose the race. And so I think it is about understanding, first and foremost, that any organisation, whatever your organisational structure, is a sort of business. It might have different business objectives. It might have social objectives as the primary purpose, but you still have to generate more money than you spend if you're going to survive. And I think that's what we see in terms of culture. It's kind of understanding that you have to continue to adapt and evolve. You have to continue to invest in your future and not just be complacent on the model that was established back in 1963 or whatever.
Is it therefore easier for smaller organisations like the National Migraine Centre to be adopting this kind of model and instigating such a culture shift than bigger ones? Or have you seen big charities that have really successfully taken on this model?
I think some of the bigger charities operate as social businesses. And although you're probably more familiar with their fundraising activities because they're targeted at members of the public, many of them will see most of their income generated through contracts and services that are competitively won in mixed markets where you've got competitors from the private sector, sometimes from the public sector too, and other voluntary organisations as well. And so I think if you're running a large charity, a substantial amount of your income is going to have to come through trading. And my boss, Lord Victor Adbawale, CBE, I used to run Turning Point. From a philosophical perspective, he always said that Turning Point, although it was a charity, registered charity, would, internally it was a social business. This is a social business because the quality of the service and that we deliver to beneficiaries shouldn't be dependent on other people's goodwill and philanthropy. That was the mindset, and that's what was important about making it a business that was dedicated to quality of service rather than constantly looking to increase philanthropy and donations and being donor focused. And I think lots of organisations that you see will be operating those models. Bernardo's is one of our members, for example, very kind of famous charity, but because of the nature of its local authority contracts, it's absolutely in that world of business.
It's very sad to hear that you do get charities coming to you when it's really too late. What is that kind of point of no return, and why is it that sometimes it's just too far down the road to save or to even consider going down the social enterprise route?
I think what you often see is reserves are depleted. You see losses being sustained over 2 or 3 years, and you see just defeat on the faces of everyone that you meet from that organisation, and it's heartbreaking. And first of all, any organisation that has existed does good work, and we shouldn't be in a state of grief every time an organisation closes. That is the cycle of life in some respects. But it's the unnecessary closure of organisations that are still vital in providing improvements in people's quality of life or experience that we should grieve. And what we continue to see is that we need the commercial skills to be able to compete increasingly in markets that are often increasingly dominated by people like private equity firms and others, children's residential care. So many markets that you would assume charities would be dominant in are actually retreating and allowing very, very extractive businesses to come in and occupy those markets instead. So I would say we've got to get real. I would say we have to be competitive. As Dan said, we have to value ourselves. So many charities don't invest in things like their brand, their marketing, developing their people, understanding new technological advancements, taking a step out and back and looking again at the business model and thinking, is this the best that we can do? Is this fit for purpose? They continue experiencing and managing and stewarding decline. If you see that happening, get out of your bubble and start talking to people that have managed that transition, because the earlier you start it, the more likely you are to succeed in it.
And Dan, just coming back to you in terms of some of the practicalities of your shift, how did you go about funding the setup of your enterprise activities during a time when I imagine, based on what you said, money was already tight?
So this, I think, is an absolutely crucial point, Andy. I think, and it's one that I know Social Enterprise UK have advocated on and helped us with, I should say, because we did find that accessing funding for this kind of transformation that we needed for a move towards a sustainable model built around an enterprising approach, it's very hard to find. The traditional organisational funders, those that we've been reliant on at many of the charities, they don't usually consider approaches for projects such as ours. So what we were looking for, I guess, was something that straddled the line between supporting a credible, costed business expansion plan and a more familiar impact-led funding application. We did find access to blended financing, part grant, part loan, initially via CAF Venturesome through our bank, CAF Bank. But what was really helpful for us, the really big investment came from the Postcode Innovation Trust. And again, we have Social Enterprise UK to thank for connecting us. That relationship was absolutely vital for us. They shared my excitement about the plan. They believed it could work. They were prepared to finance it. And the pitch we made was very much about our business plan. And we were able to demonstrate that we could go out into the marketplace and to compete against private sector providers and win. And that's exactly what's happened. So it was that initial funding that allowed us to recruit and train a new cohort of headache specialists. They're now bringing in the additional income that's allowing us to invest in our social mission, and we're on a sustainable footing. So it's difficult. And I think reaching out to Social Enterprise UK is a good first start, because they were very helpful. And I'm very pleased that we became members, because it unlocked a lot of doors in terms of funding for us that without that, we wouldn't have been able to make the transformation that we did.
And presumably that funder that you did go with, they must have had quite a high risk appetite if they saw that you were already in quite a precarious financial situation. Did you have to do much convincing?
It had to be a very robust plan. That, I think, is important, because we had to demonstrate that the plan that we had was credible, stacked up, and I was very confident that it did. We could prove that we had a business model that would deliver for us and that they were able to buy that. But it's very unlike any funding applications we'd done before when we're going to the usual trusts. Yes, social impact was absolutely important. It was vital in that application. But it was the business plan and being able to demonstrate that we had done the thinking, we had the right mix of skills. That, I think, is what won it for us.
And then, Peter, in terms of that funding landscape, I mean, can you talk more broadly about what that's like for organisations in this kind of situation and social enterprises more broadly? What are the sort of options there?
Things have improved, unquestionably, in the last 15 years that I've been chief exec at SE UK, from when I used to run a social enterprise myself. And things have got better, but there are still huge gaps in the funding market. What was different with Postcode Innovation Trust, in my experience, was they have a very much a business mindset. They have come from running a successful business lottery, and it is a private lottery, and they just seem to understand business much better. I think a lot of trusts and foundations, from my experience, without causing offence to anybody out there that might just about to write me a grant check, there's either a bit of a voluntary sector mindset, or there's a bit of a public sector mindset, with lottery funding, the mainstream lottery fund. And actually, Postcode Innovation Trust, I think, just get business. So that I thought was really, really helpful. Obviously, we've seen the advancement of social investment, impact investing, and all the rest of it. And I think the case or the opportunity is probably overstated for many organisations that tend to be either too small to borrow from those traditional mechanisms, or foundations that just simply won't fund social businesses for any particular reason, because they're cautious about community interest companies or because they don't do business development. And so it is difficult, but there is more money out there. And it's not just about looking to other sources for grants to get this stuff done. We've seen the use of community shares as a really, really effective tool crowdfunding can really, if it's well planned and well executed, can deliver new income that can fund the sorts of transitions that Dan is talking about. So every circumstance is different. You have to look at your assets. You have to look at where you are, what you need. And then the first stage of that business planning might be, where do we get the required resources that's going to enable this journey to be completed? Things have improved, but there are still big gaps. So I'm not going to say it's easy, but things are improving. And again, there are websites like Good Finance that can help people understand what finance might be available to them given their specific circumstances.
Dan, coming back to you and the things that you had to do and change to see this transformation come to fruition. You spoke earlier about your comms and marketing background. I wondered if there were any skill gaps within the existing team at the National Migraine Centre that needed to be plugged, or any new roles that you needed to create.
At board level, I think, yes, we've certainly been aware of the need to be enterprising, to adapt and to continue to be competitive in a marketplace. Now, you know, as a charity or as a traditional grant-dependent charity, I think obviously it helps to think in those ways also. But again, it focuses the mind when you're working in a marketplace, when you're actively fighting for income against the private sector. So it meant, for example, there needed to be a real understanding of the huge changes that are happening in digital healthcare, which has informed how we've appointed our board. Within the staff team, we've largely been able to apply existing skills differently. What I've actually found is we had lots of untapped skills, and with a bit of training and support where needed, we were lucky in having a lot of the experience we needed within the team, even if they'd been underused in the old model.
And I'm interested in hearing about the legal implications of your change in terms of what it meant for you, your board, and the charity under charitable law.
We continue to operate for exactly the same social purpose we always did. So from a legal perspective, obviously nothing has changed. We continue to exist as a not-for-profit, purely for the benefit of our social mission, for our charitable objects. That remains exactly the same. All that's changed for us is that we are, as I say, we have the mindset of a startup now. We go out there and we find income. We do still receive voluntary income. We have appeals. We are very grateful for the grant funding that we receive. But without that, the income we're receiving from social enterprise sources, we would not be sustainable. So nothing's changed really in terms of how we deliver our services or the purpose. We remain absolutely committed, above all, to our social impact. That's why we exist. So from a legal perspective, nothing's changed for us. We obviously didn't make the change in terms of moving to a kick, which Peter, I'm sure, could explain more about. We made the decision to stick with our existing charitable status, and the work we do continues to fit very neatly within that.
So no plans to move away from a charitable structure?
It works very well for us. Obviously, there are advantages in charitable status. We remain solely focused on our mission, on our charitable objects. I don't think for us at this stage to be considering a move in terms of any kind of legal change in how we constitute ourselves.
And is that the same, Peter, for most organisations in this situation that are charities?
Well, the rule is if the charity is trading and that trading is clearly linked to its primary purpose, then it can exist without any kind of interference from the Charity Commission. If the trading activity is not directly linked to the primary purpose, then you really do need to put it into a trading subsidiary business. But there's other models as well. You can create joint ventures with others. You can set up an organisation that is related but independent of. So there's all sorts of ways and means of doing it. And I think the thing to remember is that organisational form follows functionality first and foremost. And you can do pretty much anything within any structure, really, if you want to. So I think the first thing to do, as Dan suggested, is think about your culture. Think about your skills and your capabilities to transition rather than the structure.
And it has been wonderful to hear about the success for the National Migraine Centre. I wonder if you could tell us, though, Peter, another example of a charity that perhaps has aced the social enterprise model in a slightly different way.
There's plenty, and I think you can find charities operating in any market as you can social enterprises. I think the ones that I would kind of recognise, I've mentioned at London Early Years Foundation, I've mentioned P3 in the Midlands, St Helena Hospice actually is doing kind of great work in that regard. And there are many, many organisations who have just found ways to, I think, maximise their commercial income. I think sometimes the language of social enterprise can be a bit of a barrier. It's just about understanding what opportunities and assets you have in front of you and really sweating those to the max. There are charities, as we see right across the UK now, that are moving into things like workspace provision, diversifying into community assets that can generate income. Some have moved into things like energy, renewable energy. There are so many different opportunities out there. I think you don't want to rush in. Everyone that rushes in ends up either with more charity shops or with community cafes, and they're not necessarily always the best choice for you. However, they sometimes can be, but rarely, in my view. There are so many organisations out there that you can kind of check out for inspiration that can just forward your thinking. So get out, network, go and see what other people are doing, and don't be afraid to put a few sacred cows out there. Take the time to really consider what are the options available to you and what are the costs and risks associated with doing so, and just make a well-informed decision. And there are plenty of people out there to help and support you on your journey. People running social enterprises are some of the most inspiring people, as you've heard. They're entrepreneurial, they're courageous, they are the best, I think, of the leaders in kind of civil society in many respects, because they both maintain their values and ethos and yet find ways to take risks and be courageous and move things forward. Get out and meet inspiring people like Dan, because they will give you the courage and the guidance that you need.
In terms of networking opportunities and places where they can meet, where would you suggest starting?
Well, again, as Dan has said, the world has shifted online, and so there are plenty of communities on virtually every social media platform where you can start kind of explore. If you want a more curated approach, come to Social Enterprise UK, but there are plenty of other networks out there. There's regional networks. Normally you'll find local networks. We've got 35 social enterprise places around the country that brings communities of practice together so that people can learn and share and actually shift things on a community level together to address things like the lack of resource or understanding or opportunity in procurement. And that's where we're really seeing some great advancements. So get in touch with Social Enterprise UK and hit me up on social media platforms, and I'll try and respond to anybody that asks.
That's a very good plug. Dan, just coming back to you, I just wondered if, having gone through this process now, I just wondered if you had any top tips really for organisations that are in a similar situation as you were beforehand. What are the kind of big do's and don'ts from your experience?
First of all, I think I should reflect something that Peter said, which is there is no one-size-fits-all model that works for all charities, and the specific processes will be different at every organisation. But I do think the key lesson here, and this is the theme I think that Peter and I have been repeating, is the importance of valuing what you do and communicating that value with confidence, not being afraid to adopt a business-minded behaviour. So we don't have the luxury of behaving as if there's a clear and uncrossable line between the charity sector and an enterprising approach. One thing I think was really helpful, I mean, I've worked in the voluntary sector for decades now, and often there is this division between service delivery and income generation, and it can seem unbridgeable. Service delivery does the important work, and income generation exists entirely independently. Why? Do we have to wait until the threat of closure before we're willing to consider ways of building sustainability into our services? So, like I say, this might not work everywhere, but in my career, I've been able to adapt these basic social enterprise principles, everything from public health campaigns in the UK to providing clean water to communities across East Africa. This is a model that can be applied differently in different places. So one thing I will say, you'll likely face internal resistance. That's always the case with change. So I can't stress enough how important it is to have really robust planning and financial projections. If these are not skills that you have, bring them in, find people, network, and make sure that you have done that planning. Because without that really clear, detailed, costed plan, it's going to be difficult to bring along your board or the leaders in your organisation. But crucially, it will be impossible to bring in the external investment that you may need to make the change. So take the time to get the modelling right. When I say you need a costed plan to show the impact social enterprise can have as well, I'm not just talking about the financial impact. We aren't the private sector. We exist today at the National Migraine Centre for exactly the same charitable reasons we always did. So part of that planning absolutely meant looking at the impact. It meant looking at our social value, how we change lives. And that can be modelled as well. And we absolutely spent a lot of time doing that. I would recommend joining Social Enterprise UK. It was really important for us to build those networks. It was great at unlocking the financing that we needed. And as Peter says, there are local networks that you can get involved with as well. And lastly, I'd say don't wait for a crisis to take bold decisions. We've grown our income by well over 100% in the last 3 years. We're helping more people than we ever have. We probably wouldn't have made these bold decisions, I think, unless we'd been in a crisis. So don't wait. Peter's talked about the dangers of waiting until it's too late. I think about all the additional people we might have helped had we been bolder in terms of looking at our model before. So don't wait. Challenge old ways of doing things. You can develop that startup mindset now. You don't have to wait until your existing funding is completely dried up.
A great call to action to end it on. Dan and Peter, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Dan and Peter, and if you'd like to learn more about social enterprise opportunities, you can listen back to our past episode with Mark Jarman Howe from St Helena Hospice, which was mentioned by Peter as a true success story, and also Katie Saunders from Social Finance. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again next week to hear from two well-known funders about how they are responding to surging demand from charities. One decided to pause their funding pending a review, while the other has been vocal in the need to remain open. Don't miss it. But for now, from Andy and me and everyone at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Jude Owen.